Hi, everyone. A very, very warm welcome to today's episode. Happy Independence Day, everyone. Now, on this show, we always speak about the future and the future of work, usually. But today, we're taking on a topic that's much, much bigger, the future of India. And really, we have such a special guest with us today, someone who's lived through India's history, independent India's history, and has been one of the most keen observers of the many, many phases of India's history and independence. So I'm just going to bring him on. Good afternoon, Mr. Gurcharan. It's such a pleasure to host you for this show. We're truly, truly honored to have you with us. So now, despite the fact that Mr. Gurcharan asked me not to do this, I am going to share a little more detailed history of his background, simply because I feel that to understand his ideas and his views, it really helps to understand the wide range of experiences that he's had. So we'll start from India before it became independent. Mr. Gurcharan was born in Layalpur, which was in undivided India, and then his family moved to Lahore. Incidentally, my father's family also lived in Lahore before independence. And then, of course, when India became independent and partition happened, his family moved to India and started off in Shimla, where his father was posted on an assignment. He then moved to Delhi for a little while, and he was with modern school before moving to Washington, D.C. for high school. I assume that your family got posted there and you went with them. He then got a scholarship to Harvard University, where he studied philosophy along with political science and economics, and then got accepted into Oxford University's PhD program in philosophy. And then he made a very unusual choice. Instead of joining the program, he decided to come back to India. When he came back to India, he joined a company called Richardson Hindustan Limited at the time, the makers of the very famous Vicks Vapor Rub. It hadn't as yet become part of the P&G group. But later, when P&G entered India, he became part of Procter & Gamble India, rose through the ranks to become CEO of Procter & Gamble India and later Far East. He served in that leadership role for many years, I think 7 years, before moving into a global role at the headquarters of Procter & Gamble. And then at around 50, he made what I would say is a really unusual choice, and really at the peak of his corporate career decided that he wanted to do something different. He was always a writer. And I think all through your 20s and beyond, you wrote fiction. Many of these were in the form of plays. And he was as young as 23 when his first play got published, and it won an award. Soon after that, another play got reviewed by the New York Times and was produced by Alec Padamsee. So he was always really active as a fiction writer. But as his career grew, perhaps his interest changed. And when he became a full-time author, he decided to write nonfiction. Now, his nonfiction list itself is really long, so I'm actually going to read that out. The first book, and the book which I remember most clearly, was India Unbound. And for many of us who had started our careers, just around the time liberalization was happening in India, we were still struggling to make sense of, we felt a lot had changed, but we hadn't quite understood it or its implications. So his book, India Unbound, for me, to be honest, my family, and many, many others whom we knew, was such an amazingly clarifying book, because it helped us understand what was happening and gave us a lot of hope and optimism for the future. For, I think, many of the people who were growing up in my generation, around the late 90s and early 2000s was the first time we felt that, oh, India could become much more than we had perhaps ever thought while we were growing up. So India Unbound was, of course, a sensational book. It created ripples everywhere. The New York Times wrote about it and spoke about how something interesting is happening in India, and Mr. Gurcharan has his finger on the pulse. But that was just the start. Soon after came the elephant paradigm, where he compared, India's pace of change and India's style of change and how different it was from many of the other countries, particularly in Asia. Perhaps about a decade later, your next set of books came. India Grows at Night in 2012, and then The Difficulty of Being Good, which I really love, by the way. It's such an interesting book, such an interesting take on the Mahabharata and what it means to live a life of dharma. And more recently, Kama, The Riddle of Desire. Of course, even all of this doesn't do justice to his entire body of work, because he's been writing for the Wall Street Journal, for New York Times, for Financial Times, and has been a regular columnist for Times of India. So thank you so much for joining us. We're so, so happy to have you on our show. If I might, one of the things you mentioned last time we spoke really stayed with me, and I wanted to ask you more about that. There was something you said about, how a life is not found or discovered, but instead created. And certainly looking at your body of work and the kind of varied fields you have, actually been excellent in, it certainly looks like a life that was by design. Would you mind sharing a little bit about, what this meant for you personally? What does it mean to create a life that maybe suits your multiple areas of interest and potential?
Well, I'm delighted to be here with you, Shalini. And I would say that, we're going to talk about the nation today. And just as a nation is created, so I think is a human life, that you create a life. You don't find yourself, you create yourself. And frankly, it was not at all a designed life. At each stage, I was seeking what I was making decisions on the fly as I was living, and I broke away from each time from what was expected. And so, when I went to Harvard, I wanted to go in the footsteps of my father, who was an engineer, and I quickly discovered the humanities, the great books, the arts, and even Sanskrit. I did Sanskrit for seriously. I studied Sanskrit at Harvard, and it. So, and I ended up with philosophy. And then when I was about to go into a career, academic career in philosophy, uh, I suddenly asked myself, do I really want to spend the rest of my life at that stratosphere of abstract thought? And so I got cold feet, and I decided not to take the fellowship to Oxford and came home. And then my mother was quite embarrassed that she had an unemployed son who didn't know what to do. And her neighbor would ask her all the time in Chandigarh, "Toda munda ki kar reha?" And she would have sheepishly say, "Bhai pata nahi." And so, to spare her the misery, I saw an ad in the paper, and it was for a job looking for trainees for this company that made Vicks Vapor Rub. And so I started selling Vicks Vapor Rub. And frankly, even that was not a planned idea. And I thought I would just be like doing it for a short while until I really went on to a career. But I really enjoyed the rough and tumble of the bazaar. And so, like the man who came to dinner, I stayed on, and I stayed on for 25 years. But meantime, I also had a weekend career, which was that of as you talked about, as a writer. But I guess what I'm saying is that, and also then in my mid-40s, I had this sort of midlife crisis when I asked myself, is this what life is all about? these were all good brands of Procter and Gamble. But I suddenly said, but there must be more to life than these wonderful brands. And so I quit to become a writer. My point is, and even as a writer, I evolved into writing a book on each Purushartha. I was educating myself in each stage about a new facet of life: Artha, Dharma, Kama, and now Moksha. So it's been it's been a life which certainly not by design, but it's a created life. And I guess my point overall is this: that if you're going to spend a third of your life working, you might as well do something you love. I've always had a very simple definition of happiness, which is to love the person you live with and love the work you do. So if you have both of those, you are way ahead. And each stage, the decisions I made were not planned, but they were guided by this idea that you must feel passionate about your work. It has a way to give meaning to your life. And so the other side, the other part of the equation about loving the person you live with, well, read my book, Karma, the Desire. But I've dealt with that subject.
What's so interesting is, and we were speaking about it a couple of episodes ago, one of the most popular courses at Stanford is a course called Designing Your Life. And that course is all about discovering which activities or which fields bring you joy, and then designing your life around them. And it's just a very different way of looking at careers from the very standard. What is it that you're good at, and trying to find work in an area that you're good at. It's all about joy, with understanding that what brings you joy, and often a really good indicator of what your life should be all about. So it was really nice that you said that. I have a question for you on whether some of these ideas apply at the level of a nation itself. Do you think nations are created, or do they just are they found? Do they just grow? And I also want you to, if possible, connect this to something you said last time about how you felt India had been founded by saints. I thought that was just
Right.
such an interesting idea. I had never heard it worded like that, and I'd love to hear your take on that.
Well, I think the first thing to understand about a nation is that it's an imagined community. It's an invented community. So all these people who talk about Hindutva and who talk about, the French talk about this great sort of spirit of the Francophone spirit and so on. These are all myths that nations create ultimately. Hitler was a myth maker in that sense. And so really what ultimately a nation is not and should not be based on a religion. So we don't want to be a Hindu Pakistan. I think that was a mistake. It should not be based even on language. I mean, it's fortunate if you have one language, you're lucky. But the fact we don't have one language is not too bad. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. And now today, actually, English has become an Indian language, like cricket has become an Indian sport. The English should come and learn. Cricket from here, English from here. So the only reason, the only consent of the people, which we talk about, when we talk about self-determination, consent of the people is a person's desire to live in a place. And therefore, the job of the government is to make that place attractive through good governance, through giving predictability to life, to creating opportunities, good education. All these things make the nation attractive. And you should say, well, I want to live there. And that's the only So there's no such thing as a natural unity in terms of nation. And of course, you know, uh, Churchill used to say, oh, India is a geographic expression. And Gandhi, actually, then, Mahatma Gandhi in the 20s, his answer to Churchill was to appeal. So a leader is somewhat of a myth maker. And Gandhi was our chief myth maker. And so he employed the wonderful idea of Sadharan Dharma, not Swadharma, Sadharan Dharma, which is somewhat a Buddhist idea, actually, but it's also in the Hindu texts. The Swadharan Dharma to sell the modern ideas of nationhood, like liberty, that we want freedom from the British. That was but he did it through Dharma, or equality, that Harijans, that there should be, people should be equal. He sold it in that way, like Raghupati Raghav Raja Ram, and the idea that Ishwar Allah Tere Naam. I mean, he was creating. He was a myth maker, and so when the Constitution of India was created, people thought that it kind of fell from the heaven. But in fact, it was the people a lot of people had thought about it, and they thought about it in moral terms of our constitution makers. That's why P.V. Kane, who won a Bharat Ratna, the great Sanskrit scholar, called it a Dharma Shastra. It's a moral text, the constitution, which is, I mean, look, Dharma has got many meanings, I mean, and all, but we won't debate that. Essentially, Dharma means to do the right thing. And so the idea that the Constitution is a moral text that is creating habits of the heart, now this has to be sold. And we can take an example from the Americans who sell it every day to their children, to the people of the country, that the only thing that unites us. And what the problem is that Nehru, who made many speeches, but Nehru was a Western-oriented gentleman, and he did not speak to the language, and Gandhi died. And so Nehru's words did not resonate with the masses. And since Gandhi died, we really haven't, it's an unfinished project to sell the Constitution. So, but let me also say that India is a civilization unity. And there's nothing wrong in the notion, and we are, there've been great conservatives such as Edmund Burke, the Roger Scruton. Now we're waiting for an Indian Burke and Scruton who will be able to express this ideal of a civilization unity without dividing us. Hindutva divides us, and that's the problem with Hindutva. So there's essentially a good nationalism and a bad nationalism. We want the good nationalism. Bad nationalism is about power. Good nationalism is about your memories of childhood, the songs you heard, the river around your house, the geography, and all those kind of things which conjure things that unite us. So when you asked me about the notion that in 1947 India was born under the shadows of Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, and it was created by saints. Andre Malraux actually said this. And what he was expressing was that here was a country uniquely which had got its independence by not killing the enemy. I mean, the British just got tired and left, you know. It got Gandhi's tactics, quit India and all, got too much for them. And they were already fighting a war. And so, and plus Roosevelt was saying that, look, to Churchill, reminding him every day that he has to live up to his word. And so we were born And so we have been unique in the 20th century as a nation which has been a place of peace. And both the world wars, India, they didn't take place in India. So we didn't suffer the kind of suffering that the rest of the world did, nor did we suffer from the deaths that China, in the Great Leap Forward, Stalin's murders and all. We were spared all that bloodshed. So I think that's the way I would think about it. A
Yeah,
nation.
that's so interesting because I'm also connecting this to some of your own work, and so much of it has to do with Indian philosophy and understanding many of the Indian philosophical texts and their relevance to our lives as we live them. So, a question I have is, do you think the fact that we've had such an unbroken, philosophy that has endured over centuries, and somewhere perhaps without even being necessarily people consciously studying books and becoming pundits or becoming people who formally studied some of these texts, has it influenced us in a way that has perhaps allowed some of what you spoke about to occur more naturally, like the fact that our constitution was created as a Dharma Shastra, as you said, or some of what I think you wrote about, which was accepted in China, would never have been accepted in India because there was such a philosophical difference. So I'm wondering what you think about the fact that we've had this sort of unbroken, very, very long philosophical tradition.
Yes. Well, I think the interesting thing about the history of India is not uh, it's how old it is, but really the continuity that these texts like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana are texts that are actually shared in our country. In fact, one of the greatest renditions of the Mahabharata is done by a Muslim tribe in Gujarat. They go from village to village singing, and for them, the hero of the Mahabharata is not Yudhishthir or Arjuna, but Karna. So it's the song of Karna that they sing. So everybody has, a way of looking at the past. But coming more closer to today and where we are, I see the history of India in terms of four milestones. Now, the first milestone of independent India is 1947. But in 1947, Azadi, which we are celebrating today, um, Azadi that we got really was political because very soon after we became free, in the 50s, we lost our economic freedom because of the Nehruvian socialist model, which took us, in fact, to a dead end. And it took us 40 years to realize that. And finally, we got our economic freedom. So that's the second milestone. By the way, there's another milestone in 1975, 77, when the emergency, when we almost lost our political liberty. So the second milestone is 1991. Now, that 1991 actually is, many people just don't realize how big a deal it was. Because actually, the rise of India that we talk about today started then. And the rise, I mean, the most important event of my life, I could say, yes, I was in 1947, 4 or 5 years old, but in fact, it was in 1991 that I feel, because you can't really be free unless you're economically free. And so and that's what led then to the rise of India, means that the middle class, which was 8% before in mid 80s, went up to 33, 34% of the population. And the poor, we didn't lift poor at all in the first 30 years after independence. Everything was done in the name of the poor, Garibi Hatao. But that was a sham of Indira Gandhi. It got her elected, but she did nothing, actually. The number of percent of poverty in India was the same, pretty much, in 1980 as it was in 1950. It was really after 91, almost 300 million people rose above poverty. Now, China did even better. China, 500 million people went out of poverty and became a middle class country. But still, 300 to 350 million people, not bad. I think we should be proud of that. And really, it decolonized our minds also. Interestingly, I mean, we're talking about English, but up till 91, there was a strident criticism to remove English. But somehow we became relaxed after 91, realizing that that we were going to become part of the global economy, and English was an advantage to be part of it. And there was nothing, you don't have to remove English to build other languages. And the rise of English, for example, which is interesting, because we had always combined ever since for decades or for generations since the English came, we combined English and our local language words. But that was upward mobility. But in the 90s, English really became the aspirational, it was the cool language of the middle class. मुझे टेंशन मत दो, मैं कल कर दूंगा. There was no problem. Z television first headline news was आज Middle East में peace हो गई. Now that's half English, half Hindi. Nobody even noticed or bothered with it. But that expressed the freedom, the decolonization of our minds. And so in other ways also, there were freedom. Anyway, the third milestone. The third milestone is the milestone where we created this middle class, but we didn't recognize it. It was kind of hidden. And it is Modi's genius that in 2014, he recognized that here was a country that had changed. And so he tapped into that new middle class. He talked about this new middle class. He was very clever. He didn't use the word in his campaign of Hindutva. In fact, every time he said Hindutva, an American scholar actually analyzed it, 400 times he used the word Vikas. And Vikas was a code word for what you'd call middle class dignity. He gave dignity to the auto wala, to the kirana wala, to the chai wala. He was the chai wala's son. So people suddenly said, we have our own leader. So this idea of middle class dignity, now he's not lived up, in other words, he hasn't done the reforms to make us create the kind of jobs that the middle class expected. But the point is, though, it was an affirmation. And finally, the fourth liberation. Each one was a liberation, right? Liberation of a certain class, liberation of, finally 2018, I would call emotional liberation. Now, all the rest was in the public space. Emotional liberation is also very important for human beings. What happened in 2018? First, you made triple talaq illegal. That liberated half the Muslim women of the country. Then you made adultery illegal. In other words, adultery was a criminalized offense, but it was based on the notion that a woman is a man's property. So the other man would have to go to jail. And so they got rid of this colonial law. And they also made the homosexuality legal, which was again a colonial law that they got rid of. So I don't know how many homosexuals, maybe 15, 20% of the population got liberated. And they allowed entry into temples, free entry to temples. All this was done by the courts, by the way. And finally, Me Too, the Me Too movement did a lot for women. So I just wanted to say that this is another milestone. But let me also say that we are still waiting for one more liberation. And that is, there's a difference between being a democracy and having good governance. And we are still waiting because India has law, but China has order. You know, like the TV show, Law and Order, you need both. China needs law and India needs order. And so that's the liberation we need of the reform of our governance institutions.
That actually brings me to my next question, which is, in a sense, hidden in the tone of your books. So, your earlier books in the early 2000s were, you know, absolutely optimistic. And, there was almost an unbridled optimism about how India is just going to rule over the next few decades. But your writings in the last few years have been a lot more tempered. Uh, and I'm wondering if you would speak to whether this is a real shift in the way you see things.
No, I think the basic thesis of India now still holds. And I think India is a rising economy. But India has been a story of private success and public failure. It's a story of rising from below, the people rising, unlike China, which is a story of rising from above, where the state orchestrated, or in even the Asian tigers, the state orchestrated the rise of the country. And this is why Indians say uh, India grows at night when the government sleeps, so that we have risen almost despite the state. And we have to grow during the day now. And it was partly, I think, the research. I was worried. It bothered me, the failure of governance, the corruption, the fact that 1 out of 4 parliamentarians in the states as well as in the center had criminal records. It bothered me that 1 out of 4 school teachers in a government school was absent, illegally absent. It bothered me, the corruption in our society. And that's where I began. I went to study um, the Mahabharata, which is a text obsessed with the notion of Dharma. And so I thought maybe that one could learn a lesson. And at the same time, the Anna Hazare movement came about, and that was again a fight against corruption. And so there was India was rising, but not rising, but happiness was not necessarily growing. People were improving their lives economically, but there was still just too much. Um, so it was really that got me the work I did on the difficulty of being good, understanding the notion of Raj Dharma that Bhishma teaches to Yudhishthira in the Mahabharata. It was um, really the idea that we were a democracy, but we were not yet a, a liberal democratic state. A classical liberal democratic state has 3 pillars. It has the pillar of a state which can deliver, a state which is efficient and which can act when needed. But second pillar is that state must um, the state must act uh, according to the rule of law. And the third idea was that action of the state is accountable to the people. That's the democratic ideal. So we have accountability in that sense. We have elections, we change our rulers, and um, and you know, I mean, no matter how confident Mr. Modi may feel today, but frankly, uh, you know, he may go in the next election if things turn bad for him. So that is there, but the biggest single failing I believe is the idea that this classical liberal state that our constitution was looking at uh, had failed because of governance, because of poor state capacity. The democracy created huge demand of people for all kinds of things, free rice, free all these things, and we had and we couldn't create a delivery mechanism. So I think what has let us down is the four portions of governance, and this is why the state was created. Frankly, it was created for governance. Bhishma says, "Why do we need a state?" And you need the state because you need one, to have law and order, the police. You need a judiciary. You need a bureaucracy, and you need parliament. Now we know even I, who am privileged, I would be scared to go to the police station in my neighborhood. I wouldn't be. I'm really afraid. And the police often acts as just like a handmaiden of the chief minister. So we need police reform. Then, second is judicial reform. Uh, why should it take 15 years to get justice in the court? That's 50, and why are there 3.5, you know, these under trials? I mean, these courts, the cases that are not settled, and so it's justice denied. Justice delayed is justice denied. We may think, oh, but Supreme Court has all kinds of good rulings and they're very bright people. But at the sessions court level, the ordinary person doesn't get justice. Bureaucracy has been one of the problems. I mean, it was supposed to be the mechanism for delivery, and today it has been essentially the main roadblock. You can understand it. You know, the reality of our bureaucracy is that a person who's outstanding, delivers great results, works 14 hours a day, and there are civil servants like that. That person gets promoted on the same day as a colleague who works 2 hours a day and doesn't do anything. You can't have you work for Deutsche Bank, and you work for big
My
companies,
father was a civil
and
servant,
you
so
can't have a system which penalizes the high performer and rewards the poor performer. That's highly demoralizing. So this bureaucracy is very demoralized. And despite very good people, and despite very good judges, the system is very poor. And similarly, the case of people in parliament. So all I'm trying to say is, this is the reform. The fifth liberation has got to be the liberation of the country, which will bring us predictability in our lives. And a state brings predictability. And what we haven't done, we've achieved a lot. No question about it. We've achieved a lot. But we did not keep recreating. You know, we talked about creating, inventing our own governance as we went along. We did not do that. The Britain, we inherited a civil service from Britain. They have reformed it completely. And Australia, New Zealand, Canada, they've reformed their bureaucracies. But we have not reformed. So I would say that's the disappointment that, um, you know, that you were speaking about, and which I feel that we should not be only a bottom-up success. We need the top as well, and India needs to grow during the the day and not only at night.
So then let me ask you, as we are speaking in 2020, and as of course you know, the next few decades are going to be transformational across the world from an economic technology perspective. And I think countries everywhere, societies everywhere, educational systems everywhere are grappling with the idea that with traditional career routes changing so fast, and with our existing, and perhaps existing in many parts of the world, educational systems which were based on memorization or learning in a received format rather than creating knowledge or creating ideas of your own. um, what's your sense about how well prepared we are in India? Because you spoke about the governance challenge. You
Right,
also, I think, have written about how you've seen that political parties across the spectrum have never really supported any true reforms.
right.
So, wondering how what your perspective is on how well prepared are we in India in 2020 for a future that's going to require a lot from us, and a lot that's going to need many of these fundamental shifts in governance.
Right. Well, I must say, the new education policy is a good policy. Is a good policy because a lot of these things, like rote learning, they have got an emphasis on critical thinking, conceptual thinking, instead of rote learning. And there are a lot of very good things which give flexibility, uh, both from right from and there's an obsession with foundational learning, which is very, 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 very good. Outcomes are more important now than inputs. I mean, the whole Right to Education Act was a disaster because there was not one word about outcomes. All was the size of the classroom and how many student teacher ratio and all that thing. So uh, I feel we have a blueprint, but the problem with the new education policy, I wrote a piece a
Yeah,
few weeks ago. I called it One and a Half Cheers for the new education policy. And why? Because, I mean, why not 3 cheers? Because it did not really come to grips with the crisis of Indian education. And it's a systemic crisis. And that crisis is the problem. As I said, 1 out of 4 school teachers does not show up. And 1 out of 2 who shows up is not teaching. Teachers, only 10% of the teachers would pass the TET, which is the Teachers Eligibility Test. Teachers routinely have been hired on the basis of buying the job from politicians. And in fact, well, there's a chief minister today who's in jail because he sold jobs to teachers. And once the teacher bought the job, gave a couple of lakhs of rupees, then the teacher didn't think he or she had to teach. Anyway, those are systemic failures. And the other side of it is that today, because of these failures of the government school system, people have been pulling children out and putting them into private schools. Now, the private schools that have mushroomed are also not very good. I mean, it's the private, in fact, we think of private school as an elite school, Doon School, Mayo, and all those things. But actually, 70% of the private schools have fees less than 1,000 rupees a month. And 45% have fees less than 500 rupees a month. So it's there for the masses, but the quality of education is poor. Now, why is it poor? Because it's very hard to start a school. We don't realize it, that you need a 40 to 125 permissions, and each permission requires a bribe, and it may take 5 years to get a school opened. So honest people, idealistic educators, they can't open a school. So a businessman who sees a quick buck, or a politician with black money, he can open a school because he'll pay those bribes and get away with it. So you need autonomy for the private system. Now, half our children today are in the private school system. Our private school system is the third largest educational system in the world. And we've just ignored the fact. And the biggest hypocrisy is that all these private schools, 80 to 90% of the private schools make a profit, but they're not supposed to make a profit. They're supposed to be philanthropic. Now, that's a big hypocrisy. Why not just say 9 out of 10 countries allow for-profit education? India does not, only one. And even China allows it. And so declare educate. Don't stop this hypocrisy. Be honest that your private school can't survive unless it makes a profit. And remove the license Raj from getting a permission, etc. The inspector Raj, and you'll see private schools will also improve. You won't have this heart-rending sight every year of parents standing in a queue to get their child into a good school. And most of them don't. That's heartbreaking. So good schools will come up, give autonomy to the private sector, and reform the government sector. That's the only answer. Only thing is, now the NEP, New Education, recognizes it. But what it doesn't recognize is the systemic. Who's going to bell the cat? Frankly, teachers are politically very powerful. No politician is going to touch them. They are themselves politicians. And Mayawati was a teacher, Mulayam Singh was a teacher, and they have power in their hand, and they monitor the polls. So every politician is scared of them. And half the employees of the government are teachers. So who's going to take them on? Those are the problems. That's why I feel a little disheartened about the prospects for the average Indian. Surely the 15-20% who are in good schools, who will work despite the system, who will rise, they'll go then to Silicon Valley and they'll become head of, Microsoft or whatever. Those guys will be there, But for the average person, it's a tough situation.
I understand what you're saying, that the big revolution, as you spoke about, the reforms, which are in a sense foundational to so many aspects of our life. Education is, of course, an important one, law, healthcare, etc. Those are the pieces which haven't happened, despite 73 years of independence. And in a sense, the lack of some of those reforms and lack of infrastructure surrounding some of these systems make policies like the NEP admirable, but it may not be clear how any of that's going to actually.
So Shalini, if I were Mr. Modi and I was given the chance to speak from the Red Fort today, I would have said that, look, he's phenomenally powerful, and power means to do good, and this is the chance to do these difficult reforms. And COVID is a crisis, and the reforms take place in a crisis. So do these reforms.
Lovely. Let me just take a look and see if there are any questions that we can add. So Nirmal is asking on a one-line definition of dharma. Now, there's a whole book on dharma, which Mr. Goodchandas has written. Difficulty of being.
The line is very simple, as I said. Doing the right thing is the one-line definition. Dharma also means law. Dharma means religion. Dharma means, there are many words for it. But just think of it as the way that Emperor Ashoka thought of it, as doing the right thing.
There's a question from Ishan. What is your thought on the role of state governments in building India's future?
Well, that's a very good question. And actually, we are our record has been reasonably good in federalism. That one of the problems of this of Mr. Modi is that he's not as powerful as we all think. That the action in terms of the police, in terms of police reform, education reform, we can have an NEP, but it's the state governments that employ those teachers. And if their jobs can only come by paying a bribe to a politician, what are you going to do? So the states are powerful, and this is a good thing. It's a good thing. In fact, I would go further and give even more power to municipalities. Give more power. This we should have elected mayors, and so the lower down you can go, the better. The better. The panchayati raj is a good thing, and so on. Our states are too big. UP is too big. UP should be 4 or 5 states, and really every district should be a. Anyway, so that's, I mean, we could talk about federalism for a long time, but I agree they have given a lot more money now in the in towards to the states, and that's a good thing. I had hoped actually that Modi would have co-opted the states in some institutional structure so that they would march together, with the same drumbeat, the states and the center. Would be a much nicer thing.
There's a question from Alok Lal. How do we help people evolve finer sensibilities through art and culture? And I think you would be really well placed to answer that.
Well, yes, I mean, frankly, we should all pursue beauty. And one of the good things is to educate oneself. It's an education. Your first reaction to a painting or a piece of music isn't necessarily, it's something you acquire, and people are lucky who learn it at a younger age. Uh, and what is nice about the new education policy is that it insists that even people doing engineering, medicine, they have to have humanities as a part of the way it is in the United States. So that model is a very good model I mean, I ended up in philosophy, but I mean, I was going to do engineering, and so you don't have to do it that way, but everybody should have a chance to appreciate art, music, and these things. Hopefully, the colleges will offer these more. The schools will offer it more uh, in the
One
future.
final question. Manjunath is asking, I wish to know what are the books you would suggest as reads for managers?
Oh, for managers,
Yes.
I don't read business books. I must tell you, I never got an MBA, but I can only say.
I must say that you never got an MBA, but when you went to Harvard, 3 of the cases were about your work. So, I mean,
Well,
that's
I
getting an
went
MBA.
later to Harvard Business School for over 2 summers because just when my company appointed me as head of the company in India, they thought I better learn something about business. And so they sent me, and that's how I ended up spending the advanced, it was called the Advanced Management Program at Harvard. And they did do 3 cases.
Maybe
The
literature, like non-fiction books or anything that you
Right.
found.
I'm not very good, except I do remember that the Peters and Waterman book, In Search of Excellence, was a classic, and I would say that's still the ideas. That was one of the few books I read, and I would suggest it. Um,
Fiction,
uh,
fiction, philosophy.
Fiction, philosophy. Well, we need a lot more time to talk about it. But the great books, I would say Google great books, and 100 books will pop up. Then from those 100, Google further the areas of your interest and just read a book a month from those, and you will have. Don't stick to business books. Business books are,
No,
life is too short. Business is for doing, not for reading.
I actually I also agree about with that, because I think many of the real insights, about human behavior, or about right and wrong, or about larger philosophical questions, you won't ever find in business books, but you'll find them
And
in other
yeah,
books.
and let me just say, you had mentioned in your introduction, written introduction to this, I'm a management guru, and let me define what I think of, in my view, is a management guru. It is somebody who is good at understanding GU, but relatively useless RU, guru. And the problem, of course, is that, Shalini, that my name also contains the word guru.
Yes.
But it was always so. Until the age of 3, my name was Ashok Kumar.
No.
My my grandmother suspected that my mother gave me that name because she thought my mother was secretly in love with a Bollywood actor named Ashok Kumar. So she took me to her guru and told the guru, give this mundenu na deo, give this boy a name. And so the guru, since she put me at his feet, he looked down and he said, well, let's call him Gurcharan Das. So overnight, at the age of 3, I was transformed from the Prince of Happiness, Ashok Kumar, to the humble servant of the feet of the Guru, Guru Charan Das.
That's a
He,
lovely story.
Guru thought I needed to learn humility, but poor fellow, I think he still doesn't. He failed because I haven't yet learned humility.
What's next? I know you're writing a book.
So I've written these 3 volumes on Artha, India Unbound, Dharma, difficulty of doing good, Kama, the riddle of desire. So the 4th Purushartha is moksha, and moksha is what I'm writing on. However, moksha, the way that a lot of people think about it, is the idea of liberation from birth and rebirth according to the law of karma. But actually, the original meaning, Sanskrit meaning of moksha, was just freedom, liberation. And they give the example of a horse without a harness, free horse. And so, since I don't know if there is rebirth or an afterlife, I don't even know if there's a God. But I do know when I am not free and when I'm shackled. I do know when the ego binds me and I'm too self-absorbed or too self-important, and I see those as being the shackles in the way I live. And so um, it's about liberation in this world, Jivan Mukti, in this life, and not necessarily in another uh, life sense. So that's a preview.
Sounds fascinating. Can't wait to read it. Thank you so much for coming on our show. I realize we're at the hour. It was such a wonderful experience having this conversation on Independence Day. I'm sure all our viewers enjoyed it. And for all those of you who've watched this and enjoyed it, please feel free to share it. And a little bit of housekeeping, a replay of this will be available on my profile on LinkedIn and, of course, on YouTube, and on Monday on the Uncubed website. So, with that, I'm going to end our conversation today. Thank you so much, sir. It was such a wonderful experience. Thank you. So, for everyone else watching, I really enjoyed the conversation. I hope you did too. Stay tuned because next week we have Anuranjita Kumar, who was ex CHRO Citibank, author, entrepreneur, joining us for a conversation around diversity and what the future of diversity means for India. We're going to take a look at, of course, gender diversity, but we're also going to look at maybe some of the other forms of diversity and what we should do in our personal and professional capacities to integrate some of that. So, with that, thank you very much. Have a great weekend.